everyone, and welcome to the Knowledge Voyage podcast. This is Saiful Hindawi. Just a brief introduction here. I studied pharmacology in Scotland, and now I work in the pharmaceutical sector.
And I'm Kimberly Johnston. I studied environmental biology in Canada, and I'm an artist.
So today we're going to be talking about system science, and we had a bit of an idea that this is the best topic to start with for our first episode because it could connect to many things. Kimberly is very interested in this topic, and she's the one who got me into it. So Kimberly, what got you first into it though?
I actually had I had a class about ecosystems, and the professor started introducing these ideas, and I thought it was really cool. I went up to him after class, and he gave me a list of books that were way too complicated for my understanding at the time, but I remained very interested. And then I found different books and courses and YouTube videos.
I can see it's a very compelling rabbit hole to get into. Honestly, I can understand why you get into it.
I think it also has a bit of esotericness to it. And the idea of it being an alternative way of looking at things. I thought it was very meta, you're not just studying something in science, you're looking at the way you study science and all the other fields as well.
And also, I feel like there's an appeal of it, of being a bit rebellious, just against the reductionist and dogma of thinking about the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Challenging to the worldview that many people have as well, I think.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
I think there's a very human urge that we all have to reduce stuff into neat little categories. It makes it easier to think about them, and especially when thinking about daily stuff.
Yeah.
But I think we have to go beyond that if we into the realms of of thinking about how things are connected together. And that's really at the heart of systems thinking.
Mm-hmm.
What did you say?
A relational approach instead of a more objective approach, I guess. And when you say it's a very human urge, it makes me think of is it human or is it language and culture? I guess where do we draw the line or the boundary of the system?
Yeah, and how much would you even say that language and culture are inhuman?
Not inhuman, but I guess more mutable. Why don't you tell us what our hopes are for this podcast as we move forward into future episodes?
My general aim is to cover topics ranging from philosophy to politics to psychology, anything that really interests us. I guess we could go into more specific scientific topics as well, but I was thinking of remaining on some sort of meta level of thinking. So it's perfect to start with this episode, I think.
Yeah. So we can connect everything back to a system science perspective.
Yeah, exactly. We want to catch ourselves in the middle, because I'm sure we're gonna try and get a bit reductionist sometimes, but so it's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think
the connectedness of things.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's really something to watch out for, that you're not just using systems thinking as a buzzword or taking it out of its intended use and turning it into another reductionist tool.
Yeah, you don't want to be doing the equivalent of greenwashing, but system washing.
But yeah, so if we're talking about systems thinking, we should really define what a system is. And it seems, at least in English, system is the only word we really have for system. Sometimes you could use the word process. And so if we're talking about what makes a system, we could talk about the idea of emergence, like swarm intelligence, for example. And also a system is going to be greater than the sum of its parts. There's between the chains of cause and effect in the system, you have this sort of interdependence, so they're all kind of relying on each other. And there's also the where you draw your boundary in the system is going to affect how you interpret it. So when we say a boundary, it could be a point from where you look inwards, for example, in a mechanistic system. So you're defining what is not the system or point of relationship to what is outside of it, which would be a non-mechanistic.
Could you give an example for that?
Yeah.
About boundary setting.
So if you're thinking about your digestive system, for example, where would we put the boundary in our digestive system? So where would we say digestion begins? Does it begin with like the saliva in our mouth, like breaking down food, or like mastication or chewing because it chops the food into little pieces? But what about when you cut your like steak into tiny bites? Is that also like an extension of chewing? But also we know that we evolved cooking to make I think carbohydrates more like readily digestible. And so is our fire and cooking part of our digestive system?
Oh, that is
And now what about like
that's very interesting. That's very cool kind of perspective. I like it.
yeah, and now what about like do we stop there or do we start with, like do we go to like the grocery store and like is this also part of your digestive system? Is it, and like you could go even further like to the farm, like is what seeds do we grow? Are we then like also acting as part of the digestive system? So like
Yeah.
where do you draw the boundary? And you have to really realize what you're looking in at and what you're looking out at as well, and how these what's inside your system and what's outside your system, like how do they relate to each other? Because like systems can have very interesting characteristics, and for example, like how we said earlier, like cause and effect might be very distant and apparently unrelated to each other, which is different from a machine. And if you draw your boundary that crosses that like cause and effect between these unrelated or seemingly unrelated parts, you're not going to recognize this like flow inside your system because it's now outside of your system and unrelated. Also, a thing in a system is like there's not really hard stuff in your system. Things are kind of in a state of arriving.
What do you mean by hard stuff?
Like you're not going to have a gear and a lever that are like interrelated. Like if you think of the human body and how you're constantly changing your cells, every 7 years you're a new person. Are you made up of the same things today as you were made up yesterday? And you could also, I think, talk about on like maybe like a social system, like
trying to define a sports team by is it the uniform? If the uniform changes, is it a new team? What if the flag changes? What if the logo changes? Because it used to offend indigenous people, for example. So now they have a more woke logo. Is it now a new team? All the team members are gonna retire or even die, and now we have new team members with a new logo, with a new flag, and with a new outfit, and with new fans in a new stadium. What is left now of this old team?
yeah.
Yeah, can you give us another example of like how a system operates or what a system is?
Yeah, sure. So there's a cool example that you could say is like safe on his bike ride to work. So this is a system made up of a bicycle and a human. Together they form a
I would never ever ride the bike, just to be clear. I hate biking and I hate cycling. You may continue though.
so together they form a unlikely transport system. So as they move from place to place, they're together. The bicycle now has the property of being able to move itself, but when Safe gets to his destination, somehow his bike is still there too, much to his chagrin, though probably. You could also think about an organization or a business as a flowing system. So you could call them like constantly evolving, interdependent, messy conversational entities. And they're mostly an exchange of people talking in various ways. And so also another part of systems is that they seem to be nested inside each other. So we can say cells make up tissues, make up organs, make up the digestive system, make up safe, make up ecological communities. These are really just categories. They aren't actually inside each other in the way we think about it. And in reality, it's really like a series of relationship and interdependencies and cause and effect and feedback loops.
I think like the idea of feedback loops and studying systems that way, that's the whole idea of system science, like which is applying system thinking to scientific fields and to complex systems. So that's the definition of system science. But I think like we dedicate the next episode to that, where we examine some more of these ideas, basically.
Yeah, and so why we need that system science is because if we look at maybe sort of the emergence of like a scientific doctrine, we can trace it back to Galileo Galilei, who lived around the 1600s. He suggested that if we want to be effective in our natural philosophy and using math to describe nature, scientists should only study those properties of material bodies that like shapes, numbers, and movement that can be easily measured and quantified. So properties that didn't fit that criteria, like color, sound, taste, smell, maybe like feeling and affect, they were considered to be merely subjective mental projections, which should be excluded from the domain of science. So by excluding these qualities like color, sound, taste, touch, smell, and more complex qualities still, like beauty, health, or ethical sensibility, then emphasis on quantification prevented scientists for several centuries from understanding many of these like still essential though differently measured qualities or properties rather of life.
I think when you think about this idea of qualitative versus quantitative, you want to also think about the purpose of science. Like science could be practical or pragmatic or applied, and this is usually the area that we want to use science of. Like I don't care how true science is, how much does it actually reach the truth in a philosophical sense? How much is it giving me like justified true belief in a knowledge or epistemological sense? Isn't really as relevant to like the everyday man as much as how what is the science of my car and how can I make it go faster or consume less fuel or run on bananas or whatever. So like the practical side of applied science is what you'd find a lot of people saying like, this is why we shouldn't question science because look, science led to all these technologies. But the idea is that like we've developed technologies also based on scientific paradigms, and the closer we are to scientific truth, the easier it is to develop technologies. And every time we have a paradigm shift, it usually also corresponds to a technological shift. So the philosophy of science is very important and shouldn't be avoided.
Yeah. I think also like when I was thinking about like your sort of better car example, like maybe if we had more systems thinkers, we wouldn't have like at least in North America, like this highway infrastructure system, we might have like high speed rail instead of like car based cities, we might have like walking based cities. And like how different would that look? Why did we decide that cars were a superior technology, and is technology like what is defining, I guess, like something's better than something else, and where's the room for quality?
Yeah, because you want to be thinking about also like the purpose of this technology, and if the purpose of technology is to take me as fast as possible from point A to B, or also as fast as possible in the most amount of comfort, like that, you should define these characteristics themselves. And once you have this grasp of truth, then you could see how close these inventions or technologies go to realizing that truth. So this idea of the predictability of science and its use is at the core, of course, of the philosophy of science. And one of the great thought experiments that I tend to enjoy personally goes imagine that you are thinking from the perspective of a chicken in a coop, and that sees.
I often do.
Hmm?
I often do.
Yeah, I often like to think of myself as a chicken, especially when I'm dancing. And you're a chicken, and basically you have this farmer who is she's coming every day to feed you and take care of you and pet you and stuff. And you start to develop a routine or habit of thinking where you, based on all the evidence so far in my life of 3 years, this woman comes every day at 5 a.m., wakes me up and feeds me and then bathes me once a week, so on and so forth. So the science here would lead you to be like this woman is a caretaker and her job is to take care of me. She's my servant or slave or whatever, until on one day she abruptly decides to chop your head off. So as far as we know, the sun or gravity or any of these bigger physical concepts could change in a matter of a second. And these ideas of systems as well-defined boundaries, that like the idea that the gravity works, like one day, what if I put something down and gravity now works the opposite way? So it's just all a matter of perspective and where you're sitting in the system, and also the idea that like as far as we know, we don't know how long these systems might last.
That's one thing that I was thinking about in regards to like really looking at time and what really is time, and the only thing they really trace to it is entropy. Entropy increases.
Entropy always increases, yeah, within a system. Entropy always increases.
But you could adopt the perspective that entropy always increases in all the places that we've measured it, and so that like you keep in mind that you're limited in your perspective and you're not omniscient. And I think that leads you, like, you can argue whether that's useful or not, but I think that gives you a certain like openness, that sort of implicit belief that there's not just one way of looking at this. All right, so there's a quote I really like about systems thinking, and it says, "Systems thinking begins when we see the world through the eyes of another." So that kind of illustrates maybe the spirit behind systems thinking, trying to look at something from as many different perspectives as possible.
When you say perspectives, what do you kind of mean by that? I was just thinking, like, gonna say something like biases, worldview, and the combination of all your sensory perceptions and your assumptions about the world.
I could answer that by not talking just about perspective, but also talking about paradigm.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we could say that history is dominated by two different paradigms. So we have on one end reductionist, and then on the other hand systemic. So when we say paradigm, I'm going to use Friedrich Capra's definition and call it a set of concepts, values, perceptions, and practices shared by a community, which form a particular vision of reality that is the basis for the way the community organizes itself. Capra also goes on to suggest that history moves like a chaotic pendulum between these two sides. So what a chaotic pendulum is a pendulum attached to the end of another pendulum. And the chaotic pendulum is incredibly dynamic, and it's very sensitive to its initial conditions.
Don't you think though that like the idea of reducing like all of history to like only two paradigms is reductionist in its own though?
Yeah, definitely. But there's something to keep in mind is that systems thinking doesn't exclude reductionist thinking, it includes it. So it's a shift from either or into both and.
I see.
It's as long as it's not the only perspective, it's just one of many.
So I don't want to stop looking at the trees in the forest. I just want to see the forest, the trees, the relationship to each other, the whole,
Mhm.
everything involved kind
The birds and the moths.
of. Yeah, exactly. It's very important to notice the moss and the lichen. Something that like is also like been established through history that like you could see these trends through different like historical thoughts or different like historical paradigms that are similar to these ideas of like a system thinking versus reductionist thinking. Is that how like you would term it, or you would term it?
I think different periods would define these ideas in different ways. So you might call it the study of matter or the study of form. So here matter would be like quantities, their constituents, and form would be patterns and relationships. So form would be here core systems thinking, and then the study of matter would be what we're saying is reductionist thinking.
Mm-hmm. I see that. Yeah, I see that. And then like also like system thinking would still include the study of matter as like a subpart of it, and also the relationship between matter and form, I'm guessing.
Yeah,
Okay, then yeah, I could definitely trace how this connects to different like historical traditions. I could see like for example like ancient Chinese philosophies like Taoism with flow and constant change. That's a really quite systematic, non-linear way of thinking about the world.
did you see the yin yang a part of that too?
Yeah, like yin yang is definitely part of that ancient Chinese philosophy, not just Taoism in general, but like I think Taoism in particular emphasizes living in harmony with Tao or Tao, which is the impersonal, universal process of transformation that underlies and transcends reality. So that's very much like our the biggest, most similar aspect that we could have in Western thought is the idea of like the world of forms, where you have a world of forms where it's like there's the ideal circle, and then an apple or a ball is just a manifestation of that form. there's of course many different ways people have thought about forms in the world of forms across time.
Mm.
But I think in ancient Chinese philosophies like Taoism, it's more that like this is the reality and everything else is trying to harmonize with that reality.
Mm.
So the political implication of this Taoism was mainly an opposition to authority, government, coercion, and even to normal like socialization and values. So there was the emphasis on like spontaneity, and that's contrasted with like subtle or overt indoctrination in any specific or social Tao,
Okay.
if that makes sense.
I guess like sort of a breaking of like the constraints.
Yeah, breaking down, but they would say they wouldn't use any like action based language because it's all about like non-resistance and inaction. You get me? So it's more about
Uh, like not moving against the stream.
yeah, like so, because it implies like strain or work, and this is more of flow. This is more of like something that happens to us. We're a part of nature. We're a part of nature's harmony. So to be part of nature's harmony, you're not resisting or breaking the laws of nature. You are nature. You know, you are.
It's kind of incredible to imagine that in contrast to the way we think now, where we're so separate.
Yeah, this is the whole thing. I think like the categorization and reductionist is so like such a big part of the way we perceive the world that it's hard to imagine how actually radically different that
Mhm.
way of viewing the world is. And this can be easily related to many ancient Greek ideas that like even existed before Plato's idea of the forms. I think like the most similar is probably that of Heraclitus, who was famous for saying, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, or it's not the same river, he's not the same man." Are you familiar with that quote?
I am familiar with it because of Pocahontas, but not because of Heraclitus.
I don't remember it from Pocahontas, but I think like how it emphasizes the idea of flux or constant change is interesting. And also like I think like in Taoism they would also use rivers to describe the idea of flow. And I think like when we think of flow in general, the flow of a river is the first thing to come to mind. So it's interesting to see like how these really like separate, distant philosophies have this similarity in common in their line of thinking. But it's particularly interesting to compare Heraclitus and Tao due to another idea, and that's the idea of the unity of opposites. So Heraclitus states that the sea is the purest and most polluted water, for fish, drinkable and healthy, for men, undrinkable and harmful. And I think this is very, very interesting quote, even more than the stepping in the river one, just because of the idea of like how how we really get this dualism to be united, like the idea that like everything could be thought of as opposites could also be united, that like water is not just a symbol of life, but it could also be a symbol of pollution and unhealthiness. So I don't know, how does that make you feel?
I feel like it's really interesting, the water being a symbol of unhealthiness, because it's different from how I imagine water is always so like sparkling and pure. But as you were saying that, I was thinking about negative theology, and like, could that also be related to this?
Yeah, the negative theology is basically like negating the theos or the theosophistic aspects of the divine reality somehow. So that like instead of saying something like God is great, you would go about saying God is not great. And this might seem like a bit of like a mundane or kind of redundant exercise, but for a lot of like negative theologians, and they're present in many different philosophies, not just in the Western. frame of mind. And a lot of them, their focus for this exercise is to establish a kind of connection that the divine reality is transcendent and beyond the the way we think about things. So they're not just being, but they're also the absence of being and the nothingness. And they're also the being and the unbeing at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, which is very interesting. And like it seems like just like a bit like a tad too philosophical and like a bit too like intellectually unnecessary kind of. But like if you think about it from the idea of Heraclitus saying that like this applies to something like the sea, then it feels more tangible. Like we could use this frame of mind or framework to apply it to like the material world as well, basically.
I feel like it's a cool perspective because it really brings to like the forefront of your mind the labels you put on things and how those labels will mask the reality of what it is.
Yeah. Another Heraclitus quote that I really like is he goes, collections, they're wholes and not wholes, brought together, pulled apart, sung in unison, sunk in conflict, from all things one, and from one all things. It's a bit more out there than his other quotes, but I think it really points out the fact that one should not limit themselves to one view. He's not simply advocating reductionism as opposed to holism or dualism as opposed to monism. He just sees all these systems and views as interconnected and interchangeable, that basically everything is worth thinking about.
Yeah.
Not the wholes on their own and not the not wholes. It's just you need to think about the forest, the trees, and the moss and the lichen.
It also makes me think about metaphors and how the metaphors we use will clarify certain characteristics and hide others at the same time. And so, like, you can say the binoculars you use decide which kind of bird or moth you observe. Like, you find what you look for.
No, I like that. Especially if your binoculars are all like smogged up or you're not cleaning them properly.
But also, like, our language itself is so soaked in these metaphors that it can be very tricky to detangle what you're looking at from the way we look at it. And even the idea that we're saying, like, oh, looking at something, like the idea that there's a thing in itself, something that exists independent of me, is also it's a perspective and it's objective and materialistic. Because there's also another way that we could look at things, like if we think about it in terms of its relationship to us. Like there's a short story by Jorge Borges, which you could find in the show notes, where he describes a culture who they don't believe in objects, they only see process and transformation. And so the language of this alien race, they have no nouns. So for example, instead of saying the moon shines between the clouds, these people would say it moons between the cloudings. So it's kind of like a really cool and very different way of looking at things. And you can see it right in language itself.
I'm guessing also mooning means something very different to them than to us.
Yeah, it depends on the context, I think.
Would they still have like nouns, like proper nouns, like for names?
I think it might be like safing.
Yeah, I like that. I tend to think of myself also as like more of a safing, a dynamic process rather than a.
But just like even just a simple twist of language, like even thinking of you as a safing, it really shifts the way I look at you, because then it automatically implies that dynamism.
Yeah, exactly. It's the difference between something static and something dynamic. It's just how much you think of it as a process compared to how much you're thinking of it as an object. And that's the whole problem of objectification right there.
Also, okay, so we see this like disbelief in objects existing independently, and we can call this also a lack of objectivity, or we can see this idea in existentialist philosophy and the study of phenomenology. Do you want to tell me more about that?
Yeah, I'm not gonna try and repeat the words. They're difficult enough. I'm glad you're the one who had to pronounce them. Basically, like I would say that the phenomenology is more focused on the idea of being in the form of phenomena, which is you could think about from the name. And what it means to think about phenomena is that like you would think about something like an earthquake, for example, would be a phenomena, is something that is defined by a period of time. So a phenomena is something that exists within time and within a framework of time. And this is relevant when you start to think about being existence in general as something that exists within time. So what that implies is that like as opposed to the something static like an object like a solid ball existing in a room, if you just put an end date and the beginning, then it's now become a phenomenon. Its existence has become now a phenomenon.
Yeah.
It starts somewhere and ends somewhere, and this really like makes you think about how time is defined through our perspectives.
Mm.
So what makes us start the recording of that ball in the room at a specific time? Who decides that? And thus implied in the system of phenomenological thinking is obviously the idea of subjectivity as opposed to objectivity, because it's implied that it's within the time frame or view of the person.
So would you say that phenomenology emphasizes like the temporality and also the subjectivity?
Yeah, exactly. I think these are the most aspects that I would take, like relatable aspects that I would take from them. But like obviously these are like very deep topics that we could revisit in the future. Like tons of books have been written about
Mhm.
just the phenomenology from like the time perspective, for example. But like you could examine it from other perspectives as well. But I think like that's the most relevant and easily relatable one.
Yeah, like you can say the phenomenology is a philosophy of experience, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to sum it up. That's what the phenomenologist wouldn't like us to do, I'm guessing, though. For existence and the idea of existentialism, that was more focused on the human beings themselves as a phenomena and how it relates to meaning. So that sounds a bit like fancy as well, but if you boil it down, it's actually quite simple. What they believe is that, as opposed to essentialism, they believe that everything that exists does not exist for a specific reason or defined purpose, or does not have its meaning inherent in it or essential to it. So what that implies for humans is that like you are not created for a purpose, you have no intended purpose, you have no defined path or journey or destiny or anything like that. You get to create that for yourself, and it's artificial. Basically, if you create a purpose, it's something that you're choosing to do. So the implication for it obviously is very different, because a lot of the ancient philosophies and religions would really like focus on the essentialism, not just of humans, but like of objects and the world itself. The world is created for a purpose. Everything is exists for a reason and is part of a bigger plan or divine purpose. Yeah.
Could you apply like this sort of dynamic, sort of ever evolving purpose to also like to God, or how would you think about that?
Yeah, like I think most of the existentialists were like atheistic for a reason,
Mm.
because they saw it as like if I remove the divine purpose, if I'm removing the purpose from everything, then I don't really need a God to explain things, because I'm denying the essence of things. So I don't need a God to justify the essence of creation or why we exist. I'm not focusing on why we exist. I'm focusing instead on that we exist, and that's an axiomatic start. Let's go from there. Let's see. what this existence implies, and I get to choose what my existence means, rather than it being told to me through revelation or through some other form. Even though essentially they're saying, like, do this and do that. So are they defining the purpose? That's kind of like one of the critiques of existentialism that is somewhat not valid in my opinion, because it detracts from their main point.
So you think like the main point is just we exist and that's enough, kind of thing?
Exactly. I think like celebrating existence for its own sake, and like focusing on the freedom that entails, what was the main aim of the existentialists. And I don't think like you have to take all their assumptions or take all the conclusions to use that philosophy. So I think like you could still believe in a spirituality. You could still believe in a divine purpose if you want, but still celebrate that freedom. Well, what I think is interesting about it then is relatable to the systems thinking topic is how it focuses on subjectivism and the importance of freedom in the worldview. So it's really focusing on the fact that there is no universal law or universal purpose that we can all connect to, and that we can all just like analyze any part of a whole or any part of a system the way we like it, and we're free to do so based on whatever path we choose. The subjectivity is what's relatable here.
See.